This past week, I was waiting for my son to get out of school like I normally do. And those of you who have kids and you pick them up, there's a carpool. The carpool line is long, so I got to get there early. And so I'm normally there early, and I normally have something to read. And so I came across this article, and I can't remember the outlet, but the article was about Don Staley, who is the head basketball coach, women's basketball coach at the University of South Carolina. She won a national championship in 2017. She's the second African-American woman to win a national championship. And what she decided to do after she won this national championship was, the tradition is you cut down the net. And so in cutting down the net, she took her portion of the net and she cut it up into several pieces. And she mailed these pieces to several other African-American women coaches around the country. And she wrote them a note and she said, "We are in this together." And it was a very significant moment for Dawn, because Dawn remembered that she received a part of the championship net from the first winning African-American woman to win a national championship, Carolyn Peck. And so she wanted to further continue this and to unite all of the African-American women who were in her position, because she realized that it was a significant thing and it wasn't just about her. No doubt that this is an example of greatness, but it has nothing to do with the specific accomplishment that Don Staley had. As a matter of fact, she's taking attention off of that. And we highlight this as we are in March, celebrating Women's History Month. And it's not just about accomplishments. Accomplishments are great, but women themselves are just great in general. I think that's a good place to celebrate right there. And it's beyond accomplishments. And by God's divine order, none of us would be here if it wasn't for women, right? And so we celebrate that, and Coach Staley's story is relevant because of Women's History Month, but it's also relevant to what we want to talk about today. Not specifically, but there are a couple of things that we can point out in this story as we continue to drill down on this Element series. We've talked about 7 of them. Today is the 8th. There's one more next week. But there are 2 relevant things out of this story that I want to point out. Number one, how we handle one another and how we consider one another is significantly important. And secondly, it takes a certain kind of mindset to do what Coach Staley has done, to say in her highest moment that this is not just about me, but it's about other people as well. That takes a different type of mindset, and it means that we prioritize others over ourselves. And I love what Nicole Powell, who is the head basketball coach at University of California, Riverside, she said, "What Don did, it gets me to think bigger." And ultimately, this is what happens in our lives when God's Spirit is at work within us. It actually gets us to think bigger. It shifts our priorities, our patterns, and our thinking. And this is also constantly what the best leaders do, the best parents, the best coaches, teachers, mentors. And this is what Jesus did when he was on earth, empowered by God's Spirit. He shifted priorities, disrupted patterns, and challenged mindsets. And so there's this guy named Paul. And Paul was what we call an apostle, meaning that he helped to start churches. And this was after Jesus had been resurrected. Then the church movement began. And so Paul was one of these folks helping to gather Jesus' followers. But Paul was not a good guy at first. Paul was a bad guy. He was someone actually persecuting Christians. And then he himself had an encounter with God, shifted his life, and now he is writing to Jesus' followers in the New Testament about what it means to live a life according to God's Spirit. And so this weekend, we zoom in on this fruit of the Spirit that I think might be the least talked about fruit of the Spirit, called gentleness. And I think it's because gentleness is misunderstood and mischaracterized. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to meet me in Colossians chapter 3. And we will get there in just 1 second. This guy, Paul, that I just mentioned, is writing a letter to Jesus' followers in a place called Colossae, which is modern-day Turkey. And he is doing what Paul does, which is challenging these Jesus followers to shift their mindset and understand that when we follow Jesus, things are just different in our lives. And he's compelling them to reflect specific attributes, one of those attributes being gentleness, which is our focus for the weekend. And so I just want to drill down on about 5 or 6 verses, starting in verse number 12 in Colossians chapter 3. We'll have the words up on the screen. We won't leave you hanging. You can follow along with us. Here we go. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord has, as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace, and be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. I want to tag this message this weekend with just a simple subject: handle with care. Handle with care. Now, we have seen maybe that phraseology. We have seen other words like fragile when we get maybe packages or in situations where something needs to be handled delicately, or even if something is dangerous and if it's spilled out, it can be damaging or it can be hurtful, or maybe there's sensitive subject matter. But I'm not specifically referencing any of those things today. I'm talking about people. And so when I'm saying handle with care, I'm talking about how we handle one another, because that's what I think gentleness is about. Now, when it comes to handling one another, it's real easy to handle people that we're cool with, that we have relationship with, maybe even babies, specifically when you can give those babies back or those children back because they're not yours. But it's harder for us to deal with people who are annoying, for people who get on our nerves, for people who are disrespectful, for people who are inconsiderate, and definitely people who hurt us. Now, we hate to admit it, but we handle people categorically, don't we? We handle them, it's merit-based in terms of how we handle them, right? You will get from me what I think you deserve, depending on certain factors, right? Like how you treat me, it might be how I treat you. So that's how we tend to handle people, or at least think about it, right? So y'all know I love trying to at least model confession, right? So I'm going to just take a moment of confession and just say that, you know, I too have struggled with this. Most recently, I was ignoring the text of my mother-in-law, who was texting me about the Cincinnati Bengals in the playoffs. She hadn't texted me all year, all season about the Bengals. Now the playoffs is coming and she's texting me. And I just said, I'm not even going to respond to this. Now, that wasn't necessarily right. And she hadn't said anything about it. But there are also other situations in our lives. Now, although that's funny and, that's a little minor. But we do respond to people in ungentle ways. And we don't need to look very far to see how that happens in our culture. We don't need to look very far to see examples of how we are not handling people with care. And as a matter of fact, we really handle people with a contingency, right? And if the contingency is not met or you upset me, then you are likely to get canceled. We live in a culture and a society where canceling people, that's just what we do. Like, we will block you, we will remove you from social media, whatever the case may be. We will ignore you because you are canceled because you did not meet my contingency. And this is why gentleness is not a high value. It's not a high value because to live this out or to exemplify gentleness, it means that we don't hold things against people. It means that we have to learn how to let certain things go. And there are two things that Paul says that we should do in verse 13 that I think drive home this central part or central point of what it means to be gentle. And these are not very easy things. These are not very comfortable things. But before we get to that, I want to ask the question, what is gentleness? How do we define this? Well, there's a Greek word called praetes, and it literally means gentleness of spirit. It is the same word for meekness. Now, here's the problem. When we go to Merriam-Webster's dictionary and we look up meekness, the definition is not very positive, all right? This is what it says about meekness, all right? In our culture, it says, we endure injury without protest. So we just allow people to hurt us and we don't protest, all right? That's one definition. Another definition says that we are deficient in courage for those who are meek. Now, no wonder no one wants to be gentle. No one wants to exemplify this. Why? Because it sounds weak. It sounds like we're supposed to just be soft and lay down and let people walk all over us. But that's not what gentleness is. That's not what Paul is suggesting that we do. So what is Paul suggesting that we do? Well, here's two things if you're taking notes. Here we go. Number one, Paul says that we should bear with one another. And I want to just unpack why this is so significant for us. The Greek word bear literally figuratively means to put up with. All right, so to bear with means we put up with typically stuff that we don't necessarily want to put up with. Do you know why this is a problem in our world? This is a problem because individualism and personal freedom is our highest value. I'm going to say that again. Individualism and personal freedom is our highest value. We could just hit the rewind button in the pandemic and see how folks was acting about all of this sort of stuff. Masks and mandates on vaccinations and all that. And listen, I'm not coming for anybody or wherever you stand. I'm just saying people were really serious about their personal freedom and their personal convenience and their personal comfort. Because my comfort and my pursuit of comfort comes before you. Basically, that's a high value in our society. And the moment you present or reflect something that I don't like, you are cut off. You are canceled. There's a problem here because we don't want to deal with the tension. There's no questions, no seeking to get a little bit of understanding. I want to understand why. That's too much work. We don't want to do that. And by nature, if we do that, that means that we are bringing to ourselves some level of suffering and enduring. And that's not what we want to do. And let me tell you, the fallout of that is that's why our cross-cultural relations in this country is not good. Because we don't want to bear with one another. We don't want to embrace the tension. We just want to be comfortable. That's what we value. And you know what we say? We say, oh, that was years ago, or we should just move on past that point because we don't want to bear with one another. Yet we will preach unity. But we can't be unified if we're not bearing the load together, the tension, carrying the tension together. We can't be unified. So that means that the unity that we're really seeking is surface level until you decide something different than what I'm comfortable with. And so this is significant for those who follow Jesus because guess what? We're supposed to be the ones setting the standard. But man, when I look around, I'm just a little embarrassed. I'm just a little embarrassed of those who say they're Jesus followers because obviously they're not really reflecting what it means to bear with one another. Choosing not to bear means that we forfeit real unity. And this is just not me taking an opportunity to confront us with the cultural discomforts that we have right now. This is actually something that was going on when Paul was writing this many years ago in Scripture because the cultural divide was very significant. And this is what Paul is regularly writing about when he writes to these Jesus followers. A lot of it is cultural. How do I follow Jesus and go against the grain of the culture, still honor my brother, and still honor those who don't believe what I believe? That's primarily what he was writing about. And he says in verse 15, you can't be one body, meaning you can't be unified if peace isn't in your hearts. And that's part of what gentleness is. It's this peace in our heart that governs us and really influences how we treat one another. And it's the pursuit of peace that governs us and how we treat one. So we are gentle to one another because we are pursuing peace to be in good relationship with as much as we can. As a matter of fact, Paul even said, do everything you can to keep the peace among you. That's gentleness. And guess what? Now, we know exactly how to do this. This is not something that's foreign to us. We know how to do this with people we want to adjust with. We know how to do this when maybe it's a little uncomfortable for us, but on the back end, there's a payoff for us. There's something that we can benefit. So we will endure because we get a chance to get a kickback or benefit, but let it cost us a little bit too much. It's not what we're interested in. Now, I should say that being gentle, it's not about being a doormat. It's not about allowing people to walk over us. But it means that we offer grace and mercy. Why? Because this is what God offers to us. That's what it means. So number one, we bear with one another. And then number two, it gets harder, unfortunately. Forgive one another. I just heard somebody breathe. This one is hard because it has to do with offense against us. Now, if it didn't specifically hurt me or, it's not directly bothering me, then that's different. But when it hits me and when it hurts me and it's personal, it's completely different. Because when we have been wronged, it is painful to us. And human nature wants justice on our terms. And forgiveness, honestly, sometimes seems like, man, letting people off the hook. I can't just let you off the hook. But here's what we don't realize. We don't realize how corrosive unforgiveness is. We don't realize how it's hardening our hearts. We don't realize how it's holding us down. We don't realize how the anger and the resentment is really holding us back. And you know what? The truth be told, sometimes the person they don't went on with their life. They might not even know you're upset with them or you feel that way, and you just carrying all of this weight. it's corrosive, it's radioactive, and it doesn't allow us to love the way that God has called us to love. I was thinking about this, and I was reminded of this very, very controversial story that happened about 2.5 years ago. It was September 6, 2018. Botham Jean was a young African-American man who actually was a worship leader at his church. And he was killed in his apartment, sitting in his apartment. And Amber Geiger, who's a police officer, was getting off of her shift, and she was on the wrong floor. And so she goes into this apartment. She opens the door, notices that I guess the door was unlocked, and sees a person there. It's dark. She pulls out her weapon, and she shoots, and she kills Botham Jean because she thought he was an intruder. And this made national news, and some of you may remember this story, but it made national news because Botham Jean is an African-American man, and Amber Geiger is a female police officer. And we've seen the tensions regularly between police and civilians, specifically African-American people and civilians. And so this thing blew up. But what blew up even larger and made the story even bigger was what Botham Jean's brother did in the courtroom. What he did in the courtroom at sentencing was, upon giving his testimony, he then spoke to the judge and asked the judge if he could step down and give Amber Geiger a hug. And it was problematic for many reasons. But Botham Jean's brother said basically the same thing that Colossians 3:13 said. As God has forgiven me, I should also forgive you. Many people were disgusted by that. Many people were frustrated by that. Many African-American people said it was a tragedy and it was a shame. And this is another example of how white Christianity and the white Jesus has a hold on black people. Now, I mentioned this to you before because I want you to understand that this is a significant apologetic issue in this multicultural, multi-ethnic space that we are in. These are the things that we need to understand and we need to know that exist, that divide us. It was a problem. But Botham Jean's brother said, this is what I must do. This is what I have to do because this is what God has done for me. But let me ask you, there's one thing to see someone else do it. Let me ask you, if someone had unjustly killed your brother or your sister, let me ask you, would you be as willing to openly forgive? Would you be willing to say, I'm not going to cancel this person. I'm going to release them. And the way that I'm going to release them is I'm going to forgive them. Now, I'm not asking you to give an answer to that question because many of us don't know unless we're in the situation. But I am asking you rhetorically to process and think about it because this is the reality, all right? Because sometimes we think about forgiveness or all of these things on a sliding scale. That now this is cool, but I don't know about this, if we're being honest. But there is no sliding scale. It is what it is. And here's the other thing that we have to remember. Is that we cannot do this kind of thing in our own power and in our own strength. It's not possible. And even if we have moments when we can, it's not sustainable. And that's why the fruit of the Spirit is called the fruit of the Spirit, because we are empowered to exemplify these fruit by God's Spirit active in our lives. And let me just throw something out here to the Bible scholars in the room real quick, or the people who are familiar, a little bit familiar with Scripture. We've heard of the Good Samaritan story, right? Well, the Good Samaritan story is basically a reflection of what I just discussed. The Samaritans and the Jews did not get along. Culturally, there was a divide. The Jews looked down upon the Samaritans because they were half-breed, and they were oppressive at times towards the Samaritans. They did not treat them well. Well, the whole thing with the Good Samaritan story is that there were two prominent Jews in prominent positions who ignored the Jew who was beat down, left for dead on the road. It was the Levite and the priest, right? Who were too busy. But it was the Samaritan who said, hey, let me care for this man. Let me not only just care for him, let me get him to a safe place, and let me pay for him to be taken care of. And whatever isn't covered, will you bill me later? That's what the Good Samaritan story is about. It's about the one who was oppressed saying, no, I need to do the right thing. And then Jesus asked the question, so then who is your neighbor? That is your neighbor. That's his response to the question, who is my neighbor? The Good Samaritan is not how we label it now. Someone who was just nice to somebody in distress. That's not the same thing. An enemy. Someone who wouldn't give you time of day. That's what this story is about. And this is essentially what Paul is saying about bearing one another and forgiving one another. Let me just bring this to a close for us. Colossians 3:5, 9 through 11. 5 through 9, and then verse 11. This is what Paul says. He says, put to death sexual immorality, put away anger, wrath, filthy language, lying to one another. All right? Basically, he's talking about how we mishandle one another physically and with our mouths. And he says, don't do that stuff, but clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. 3 of those 5 are fruits of the Spirit, all right? But here's what I want you to notice. Like, he's using the metaphor of clothing yourself, right? Which has a lot to do with how we identify ourselves, our clothing, how we dress. All of those things say something about our personality and our mindset. And so Paul is saying, clothe yourself in these things because you are God's chosen. This is why my parents would tell me, son, you better act like you know who you are and whose you are when you leave my house. Because Symonette means something. It is a reflection of something. And more importantly, it is a reflection of me, of us, was what my parents would say. And so Paul is saying how we handle each other is a reflection of God's kingdom. So what does it say when we bear with one another, forgive and love unconditionally? It says that we are going against the cancel culture. That's what it says. It says we're going in a different direction. And Paul knew that this whole thing around gentleness was so significant that he wrote about it 6 different times in his letters, repeating it over and over again. And as a matter of fact, Peter, who was one of Jesus' disciples, and James, who was the brother of Jesus, they write about it too. So gentleness is significant. I want to give you this one metaphor before we close that I think maybe kind of helps us wrap this whole thing together. I want to talk about, just real quick, or just highlight for you, 2 items: a sword and a scalpel. Both are sharp objects. Not a real sword, obviously, but you get the point. They're both sharp objects. This sword right here and this little scalpel. The sword is typically used for battle. It can be used offensively, defensively. And then the scalpel is primarily for dissecting and for surgery. But too many times, we as Jesus followers, we really want to kind of act like Peter, who was real gangster and said, hey, listen, I'm cool, but if you cross me, I will cut you and you will get shanked. I'm packing at all times. That's how Peter rolled. But how we handle people is not with the sword. Now, the sword has its place. It does. But I liken how Jesus handled people with a scalpel. When you think about a scalpel, think about a surgeon. When a surgeon cuts, the purpose of the cut is to promote healing. It's to make things right in your body. That's the purpose of the cut of the scalpel. And so, inevitably in our relationships with one another, there's going to be cutting. But is our approach and how we handle one another, is it gentle where it promotes healing? It doesn't mean that there won't be pain. It doesn't mean that there won't be discomfort. But at the end of the day, the intent was about being gentle. And one of my regular prayers is, God, as a pastor, as a leader of people that you've given to me, I know at times I'm going to have to cut, but help me to be like a surgeon that is promoting healing in your people and how I deal with your people. And so let me ask you, are your words, are your actions, are they promoting healing? Are you moving with the intent of acting as if you have a scalpel? It's much easier to not care. It's much easier to cancel. It's much easier to cut off. And oh, by the way, it takes a lot of training to use this well. And so that means that we have to be fully submitted to God's Spirit in our lives, and we've got to study and we've got to understand what it means to really exemplify these things, because it's difficult. And it's not about weakness, which is what it seems like meekness is saying we are or have to be. It actually takes exceptional strength to be able to live our lives in that way. So my question to you as we close is, what does your handling of people look like? Are you regularly handling people with care? Your friends, your family, your neighbors, strangers? It takes extraordinary discipline to be able to do that. And the only way we can do it is to be fully submitted to God in our lives so that we are empowered by His Spirit. Because by other means, it won't happen.